Okay, so sort of already started. The Brunner fans are saying that we forgot about the wonderful software and we didn't customize it and use the software, and how powerful it is, and you can do this, that, and the other. So this video is to cover that. No, we did not actually forget about it, but we were flying a Cessna 172. We used the profile that was created by Stefan Brunner that we downloaded from their website. And that's what we used to do the review, was the profile they created for the plane we were flying. And I think that's the fairest thing to do. Now, this video, I show you the software and some of the changes you might, could, should, or maybe not make if you're flying a Cessna 172. And of course, there's profiles for other planes as well. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. And by the way, the video is already, I think, over an hour long, so going into the Brunner software at that point, I mean, how long of a video do you really want to watch? Hey, Michael with XForcePC. This is a little preemptive strike. I know we're going to get beat up pretty badly over Austin's review of the Brunner Yoke, so I wanted to look a little bit at the Brunner software and talk about some of his complaints that maybe could be addressed by just making some settings changes. One thing, he said there wasn't enough force when the yoke is, when the plane is sitting at idle, the yoke tends to go all the way forward from the weight of the elevator. Well, in the Cessna 172 profile, the pull force when the yoke is pulled forward by the elevator weight is set to -40. If you want that to be greater, you can change it to -100, and it will change instantly as soon as you hit apply. Now, it doesn't make the yoke go forward any faster. It still goes forward at a fairly slow rate, but it increases the amount of force required to bring the yoke, the elevator axis, back to center. So that's one setting you can play with to sort of alleviate one of Austin's complaints. Motor vibrations is another one. They're enabled, and the percent force is set to 80, which, I mean, that's probably fine. The frequency minimum, I would recommend setting that at 1 in a Cessna 172. And probably set the frequency maximum at something more like 60%. Because this will make the vibrations at a lower frequency when you're at idle, and when you're at max throttle, they won't go to quite as high of a vibration, because as we know, a Cessna 172 is not a particularly high revving engine. I think it goes to about 2,500 RPM. So the other thing was the stick shaker. The stick shaker in this profile is turned on by default. You can simply uncheck that box to turn it off and hit apply, and so then you no longer have the stick shaker. And so what the stick shaker was doing is when you get up to the stall speed, all of a sudden the yoke would just start violently shaking, and you typically find that in, I believe it's in airliners, you typically find that, or jets, where that's your stall warning, is the stick will start shaking. Now, there's a lot of other settings, as you can see in here. I'm only on the effects tab. There's also a buttons tab where you can program your buttons. This looks a little wonky, I think, because I'm not using 100% desktop scaling. So in Windows, as you probably know, you can scale your desktop, and we've got it scaled to 150%, and I think that's messing with this program a little bit. Let's see, you have access range settings. I haven't even gotten into this. I don't, quite honestly, totally understand every setting in here. Some are quite obvious as to what they are. You have access force settings. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. But then, of course, the amount of force feedback that you're going to feel. The move back forces, it looks like, as well. Yeah, and then you have a curve here, which you can change as well. So it looks like here you could probably make the forces increase even more as you turn it. As Austin mentioned, when you turn the yoke, it should get gradually stiffer and stiffer as you turn it, which this one does. But if you want to make that effect even more, I believe this is where you would go in and make those changes. I'm not going to make any changes in here right at the moment, but it looks like that's where you would go in and do that. Then over here on the autopilot, so we mentioned on the review that the autopilot, the yoke would actually turn whenever the autopilot made changes, and this looks like basically what controls that. And then if you forcibly move the yoke, like the yoke's trying to bank to the right with the autopilot, if you try to pull it left and you force it, it'll automatically disengage the autopilot. And I believe those settings are in here as well as to how hard you have to do that before it disengages. Hydraulics, again, I'm doing some assuming here, but I assume this means you're flying in a plane that doesn't have like pulleys and wires and rods that move the control surfaces. It's run by hydraulics. So you wouldn't have the situation most likely where you get on the throttle and the wind hits the elevator and straightens out the pitch axis, things like that. There's a shutdown tab. Looks like this controls basically when you close the program down, what does the yoke do, and also looks like you can have it automatically shut down, maybe when the sim disconnects. It'll just save you a step, I guess. This also controls the trim velocity. So there's a trim, up and down on here, and if you feel like it's moving too fast or too slow, you can compensate for that in here. So again, what I would do, the Stefan Brunner profile that we downloaded based on Austin's feedback, because he's the expert, again, I would probably put the pull force on the yoke when it is for the elevator weight. I'd have that set to -100 instead of -40 just to maximize that force. Motor vibrations, I'd set the frequency to 1 all the way as low as possible when we're at idle and no higher than 60. And that's just kind of a spitball number there, that's 60. I think it was set to, might have been set to 100. Anyway, you could have seen that earlier in the video. And then ground vibrations, you might want to turn those on. I haven't played with those yet. But then the stick shaker, I would uncheck the stick shaker for flying a Cessna 172. So those are, some of the things we talked about in the yoke review of all 4 yokes, and this specifically relating to the Brunner.